Porsche arrived on a Thursday morning, and it came on a flatbed. Joel Mercer watched it from the window of his garage. The small one, the one with the hand-painted sign above the door that said Mercer Auto in letters he'd stenciled himself because he couldn't afford to pay someone else to do it. He'd been drinking his second coffee of the day, the one that had gone cold because he'd forgotten about it, which happened more often than he cared to admit. His daughter Abby was at school. The shop was quiet, and then the flatbed pulled into the gravel lot, and everything changed. The car was a Porsche Taycan Turbo S navy blue, the kind of color that looked almost black in shadow and electric in sunlight. Even sitting dead on a flatbed, it looked like it was moving. Joel set his coffee down. The driver of the flatbed was a thin man in a yellow vest who handed Joel a clipboard and said nothing beyond what was printed on the work order. The vehicle had been towed from a private estate 40 minutes north of town. The owner had requested it be brought to 3 different dealerships over the past 11 days. All 3 had returned it unresolved. The flatbed driver shrugged when Joel looked up from the paper. "Don't ask me," the man said. "I just drive the truck." Joel signed for it. The flatbed lowered the Porsche onto the gravel with a mechanical whine, and when it was down, Joel walked around it slowly, hands in the pockets of his jacket. There was no visible damage. The paint was perfect. The tires were barely worn. From the outside, it looked like a car that had never had a single thing go wrong with it. He crouched beside the front wheel well and stayed there for a moment, just looking. Inside the car, on the passenger seat, was a single sheet of paper, a printed summary of everything the 3 dealerships had tried. Joel read it standing in the cold, his breath coming in small white clouds. 11 days. Roughly $400,000 in diagnostic time, software updates, and parts replacement across all 3 shops. The car still would not start. He folded the paper and put it in the pocket of his jacket and went back inside to finish his coffee. Her name was Claire Sutton. Joel found that out when she called the shop 20 minutes later. She didn't introduce herself as a CEO or an executive or any of the things she was. She said her name, and then she said she was following up on the vehicle she'd sent over, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who was accustomed to things being handled without needing to explain why. "I read the summary," Joel said. "Then you know what we've been dealing with." "Roughly." There was a pause on her end. Not an uncomfortable one. More like the kind of pause a person makes when they're deciding how much patience to extend to someone they haven't yet decided to trust. "The last shop told me it was a software fault in the thermal management system," she said. "They replaced the entire module. Before that, the second shop said it was the high-voltage battery contactor. Before that was the charging port assembly," Joel said. "I read the paper." Another pause. "Can I ask what your background is, Mr. Mercer?" He looked around the shop. At the pegboard hung with hand tools. At the '94 F-150, he was halfway through rebuilding for a retired teacher outside of Perry Sound. At the kettle on the workbench that had been there since his wife was alive. "I spent 16 years as a senior engineer at a Tier 1 automotive supplier," he said, "mostly powertrain and battery systems. I left 6 years ago. Why did you leave?" It wasn't the question people usually asked. Most people stopped at the job title. "Personal reasons," he said. She didn't push. He appreciated that. "So you know EV architecture." "I know enough." "The dealerships knew enough too," she said. And there was something in her voice then, not bitterness exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has paid a great deal of money to be disappointed. "I need to know if you can actually find what's wrong, Mr. Mercer. Not whether you think you can, whether you can." Joel looked at the Taycan through the window of the shop. In the flat gray light of a November morning in northern Ontario, it looked less like a car worth $250,000 and more like a very beautiful, very stubborn puzzle. "I don't make promises about cars I haven't looked at yet," he said, "but I'll tell you what I find." She said that was acceptable. She said she'd call back at the end of the day. She didn't say thank you before she hung up, but he didn't hold that against her. He started with what nobody had touched. That was the thing about experienced techs at big shops. They went for the most complex explanation first, because that was where the billable hours lived and because it was easier to justify replacing a $4,000 thermal module than to explain why you'd spent 3 hours checking basic continuity. Joel had seen it his whole career. The tendency to look past the obvious because the obvious felt beneath the problem. He pulled the Taycan into the bay. He connected his own diagnostics equipment, the older stuff that he'd bought secondhand when he left the industry, and had kept updated every year because he believed in good tools the way some people believed in good boots. He ran a full scan. He looked at the error codes without assuming any of them told the full story. Then he started at the beginning. The high-voltage system on a Taycan was a carefully orchestrated set of conditions. Every component had to confirm readiness before the system would allow the vehicle to initialize. It was designed that way on purpose, safety first, startup second, which meant that if even one sensor was sending the wrong signal, the car would sit silent no matter how many modules you replaced downstream. Joel worked slowly. He wasn't in a hurry. Abby didn't get out of school until 3:30, and there was nothing else in the shop that was urgent. He worked the way he'd always worked, which was methodically and without music, because music made him miss things. The shop smelled like cold concrete and motor oil, and faintly, the cedar air freshener his daughter had hung on the pegboard because she said the shop smelled too much like a shop. He found it at 11:47 in the morning. It was a thermal sensor on the battery pack, not the sensor itself. The sensor was fine. It was the connector, a small, plastic-bodied connector with 6 pins, the kind of thing that cost about $8 at a supplier, and that no one had thought to physically inspect because the diagnostics showed the sensor as functional. And it was functional. The connector was the problem. 2 of the 6 pins had micro-corrosion at the contact surface, almost invisible. The kind of thing you had to hold a light at an angle to see, and under certain temperature conditions, specifically the cold-soaked conditions of a Canadian November morning, the resistance at those contacts climbed just enough to push the sensor reading out of the acceptable range. The car's safety logic read that as a fault. The car refused to start. Joel sat with it for a moment. 11 days, $400,000. 3 dealerships with certified EV technicians and factory diagnostic tools. $8 connector. He didn't feel triumphant about it. He'd stopped feeling triumphant about things like that a long time ago. After enough years of watching smart people overlook simple things, he felt, if anything, tired in the specific way that comes from understanding exactly how something went wrong. He cleaned the contacts. He reseated the connector. He used a small amount of dielectric grease on the pins, the way he would have done for any connector in a cold weather environment, because that was just good practice. The kind of thing his mentor at his first job had shown him in 1997 and that he'd never stopped doing. He got into the car. He pressed the start button. The Taycan came to life so quietly that for a moment he thought nothing had happened. Then the instrument panel lit up. The climate system began to hum. The battery readout showed a full charge. Joel sat in the driver's seat of a $250,000 car in a small-town garage in Ontario and listened to it run. Then he got out, went inside, poured himself a coffee, and waited for Claire Sutton to call. She called at 4:15, 10 minutes after he'd picked Abby up from school. Abby was at the desk in the corner of the shop doing homework with her headphones in, which meant she was probably not doing homework, which was a battle Joel had decided not to fight today. "It's running," he said when he answered. A silence. "I'm sorry? The car. It's running. You can arrange pickup whenever you'd like." Another silence, longer this time. He heard her exhale, a small, careful sound. What was wrong with it? He told her. All of it. The connector, the micro-corrosion, the cold temperature resistance increase, the way the safety logic had interpreted the sensor signal. He didn't simplify it more than necessary, because she'd asked a real question and deserved a real answer, and he'd learned years ago that most people understood more than you gave them credit for if you just explained things clearly. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "An $8 part," she said. "More or less, 3 dealerships. Yes, 11 days. Yes." He waited. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Outside the shop window, the sky over the tree line had gone the deep orange-pink of a late November sunset, the kind that came early up here and was always more beautiful than you expected. "How long have you been running that shop, Mr. Mercer?" she said finally. 6 years. And before that, you were a senior engineer. Yes. Why did you really leave? He hadn't expected her to come back to that question. He looked over at Abby, who had taken her headphones off at some point, and was watching him with the particular attention of a 12-year-old who knows something important is happening but doesn't want to let on. "My wife died," he said. "Cancer. Our daughter was 6. I needed to be home." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. "I'm sorry," Claire Sutton said, and she said it the way people say things when they mean them and don't have anything to add, which Joel had come to prefer over people who filled the space with more words than the moment needed. "It's all right," he said. "We're okay." Abby was still watching him. She'd always had that quality, even when she was very small, the ability to understand more of a conversation than she was supposed to, just from watching his face. She'd gotten it from her mother. Joel turned slightly so she couldn't read his expression. "I'll have someone arrange pickup tomorrow morning," Claire Sutton said, "and I'd like to discuss your fee. I'll email an invoice tonight." "I assumed your rate would reflect the outcome," she said. "Given what the other shops charged, my rate is my rate," Joel said. "Same as anyone else who brings a car in." She didn't argue. He hadn't expected her to. She asked for his email address and he gave it to her, and she said she would be in touch. And this time when she said goodbye, she meant it like a thing with some warmth in it. He hung up and stood in the shop for a moment, listening to the Taycan idle at the far end of the bay. "Did you fix it?" Abby said. "Yeah." She nodded like this was not a surprise, because as far as she was concerned, it never was. The car left on a flatbed the next morning, the same thin man in the yellow vest who had brought it. Joel watched it go from the window the same way he'd watched it arrive, with a coffee that was slowly going cold. He'd invoiced for 4 hours of diagnostic time at his standard rate. The total was less than what any one of the dealerships had charged for a single afternoon of work. He wasn't making a point by it. It was simply what the job had taken. What he hadn't expected was the call 3 days later. It was Claire Sutton again, not to discuss the car. The car was fine, she said, running perfectly, which he'd assumed. She called because she'd been thinking about what he'd said, about leaving a senior position to run a small garage, about his daughter, about the kind of choices you make when the life you were building suddenly has a piece of it gone and you have to build something different from what's left. He stood in the bay, leaning against the workbench, and he listened. "I've been running my company for 14 years, she said. "I started it when I was 31, in a city where nobody wanted to talk to me, in rooms where everyone else already knew each other. I've made a lot of decisions in that time that I thought were the right ones, because they were the efficient ones. The fastest path from the problem to the solution. That's not always wrong," Joel said. "No, but it's sometimes the reason you spend 11 days and $400,000 not finding an $8 connector." She paused. "I keep thinking about that." He understood what she was saying. He'd thought about it too, in the days since the car had left, because that was the kind of thing that stayed with you. Not the solution itself, but the shape of how it had been missed. All that effort aimed at complexity when the answer was at the beginning, in the thing nobody thought to look at. "The first shop," he said, "probably had more tools than I do. More staff, more diagnostic software. Yes, and that's exactly why they didn't find it." She was quiet for a moment. "Explain that to me." So he did. He talked about the way diagnostic systems were designed to surface the most statistically probable fault, which meant they were biased toward complexity. Because complex faults were what technicians trained on and what manufacturers designed around. He talked about how a simple connector fault in a high-voltage system was low on the probability tree because it was the kind of thing that was supposed to be caught before the car ever left the factory. He talked about how experience didn't mean knowing more. Sometimes it meant knowing what to discount, and sometimes that discounting was the problem. She listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. "You'd have been good at my kind of work," she said when he finished. "Different kind of problem." "Not that different. At a certain level, it's all the same thing. You're looking for the place the system is lying to you." Joel didn't answer right away. Outside, a light snow had started, the first real snow of the season, and it was settling on the gravel of the parking lot in the tentative way of snow that wasn't sure it was going to stay. Abby would want to go out in it later. She still had the same reaction to first snow she'd had when she was 4, as though it was something that had never happened before and might not happen again. "Maybe," he said. "I'm not trying to recruit you," Claire Sutton said, and there was something close to a laugh in her voice. "I gave up thinking I could solve everything by finding the right person. I've learned that sometimes the right person is already doing exactly the right thing." He stood in the door of the shop and watched the snow fall on the parking lot. "How's the car?" he said. Perfect. I took it out this morning. First time I've actually enjoyed driving it. You should get those connectors checked every 2 years up here. Cold weather and roads salt. I'll bring it to you. That's an hour and a half drive from the estate. I know, she said. I'll bring it to you anyway. That evening Joel made dinner. He made the same thing he made on most Friday nights. Pasta with the jarred sauce. Abby liked, even though she was at an age now where she pretended to have more sophisticated opinions about food than she actually did. He put the water on and thought about the conversation, not about Claire Sutton specifically, but about what she'd said. The part about the right person already doing the right thing. He hadn't thought about his old career in a long time. Not with any real wanting, anyway. The first few years after leaving, he'd sometimes caught himself looking at job postings, more out of habit than desire, the way you sometimes drive past the house you grew up in without meaning to. But that was a long time ago now. Abby had grown up here, in this town, in the apartment above the shop. She knew the names of his regular customers. She'd learned to hand him tools before she'd learned to ride a bike. Last winter, she'd correctly diagnosed a misfire on a customer's minivan by listening to it idle for 30 seconds, and he'd watched her face when she figured it out and thought, there it is. He didn't miss the career. He missed the person he'd been in it sometimes, younger, more certain, less acquainted with the particular quality of grief that rearranges things. But that person hadn't known what he knew now, and the trade felt fair. The water started to boil. Abby came downstairs with a history textbook under her arm, dropped it on the table in the way that suggested she had questions, and sat down. The lady with the Porsche called again, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd heard enough of the conversation from the shop. Yeah, is she going to bring it back? Probably. Abby considered this. Good, she said. That's a nice car, Joel added the pasta to the pot. It's a car, he said. It's a very nice car, Abby said, with the particular precision of someone who has spent her whole life in a garage and has opinions about these things. He didn't argue. The work order from the second week of December listed a Porsche Taycan Turbo S for a scheduled multi-point inspection. He'd blocked off the whole morning for it. He was on his third coffee and still a few minutes ahead of schedule when he heard the gravel crunch in the parking lot. He didn't go to the window this time. He went outside. Claire Sutton parked the Taycan herself, without a flatbed, without a driver. She got out wearing a dark coat and boots that were practical for the weather, not the kind of footwear he'd half imagined from the sound of her voice. She looked like someone who had learned to dress for the place she was in, rather than the place she'd come from. She looked at the shop, at the hand-painted sign, at the pegboard visible through the window. Smaller than I expected, she said. Most things are. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was considering something. Then she held out her hand and he shook it. Thank you, she said. I don't think I said that properly the first time. You said it well enough. She handed him the keys. He looked at them for a moment, the weight of them, the understated way good things were made. Then he looked up. 2 hours, he said. There's a coffee shop across the road. The chai is better than it looks. She glanced across the road, then back at him. I'll stay, if that's all right, she said. I've been meaning to understand more about how these systems work. Joel looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back and held the shop door open. The snow had stopped in the night, and the morning was clear and very cold, the kind of cold that made everything sound sharper. Inside, the shop was warm, and the Taycan fit neatly in the center bay, and the light came through the high windows the way it always did in winter. Low and direct and honest, the kind of light that showed you exactly what you were looking at. He started at the beginning. That was the only way he knew how.